let's all welcome David Sayer. David, up to you.
Thanks, John. Thank you so much. And good morning, Linden Ponds from Saratoga, New York. Thank you for attending this session. And I'll say up front, thank you for your bravery, because this topic, how's the sound, by the way? Am I all right?
Comes, of course, good.
Okay. So this topic of plastic pollution, like climate change, is, to use a Massachusetts expression, a wicked problem. It's a meta problem. It's so large that many are overwhelmed and anxious about our future. So by joining us, you're one of the brave and someone who wants, I'll assume you want to confront and examine your relationship or our relationship with plastic. Now this picture, which some of you have noticed, I use for my background, it's a mobile art installation from the artist Vaughn Wong. And this is set up outside last year's United Nations Environmental Assembly in Nairobi, Kenya, where the first steps for a global plastics treaty were taken. And the treaty negotiations have begun. So this is a very exciting time. Here we go. So yes, I'm David Sayer, and I'm here as a concerned citizen and as a graduate of the Beyond Plastics course. The title of my talk is Turning Off the Tap, which is what virtually all scientific and policy experts agree needs to happen. And that is to stop the flood of plastics, and especially single-use plastics, into our everyday lives and environment. In my spare time, I do environmental remediation of plastic pollution, which is to say, I pick trash. I'm sometimes joined by members of my local sustainability organization, but mostly I'm a lone trash vigilante. And while it feels great, I'll be the first to tell you that it's a false solution to the plastic pollution crisis. You've heard a little bit about me. I do IT consulting. I'm what they call a cloud architect. Here's a picture of my family just before we became empty nesters. I enjoy cycling and exploring Saratoga County. My local sustainability organization is very active, and I organize trash cleanups for them. And about 2 years ago, I took the Beyond Plastics course with Judith Enck, and have remained an engaged volunteer, only volunteer with them. And I'm getting to know and working with a growing nationwide network of committed plastic activists, or we call them plastivists. So, hey, I want you to know that I jumped at the chance to speak to a men's group because for reasons I can't understand, we are woefully outnumbered when it comes to plastics activism. In all the classes, groups, and local chapters I've seen, I'm sure men are less than 10% of those participating. So I feel that if we are going to have a fighting chance at beating back plastic pollution, we'll need much more concern, energy, and visibility from our half of the population. So hopefully after our brief time together today, you'll see plastic not as an essential nuisance, but as the United Nations puts it, a triple planetary crisis of climate change, nature loss, and pollution. And by the way, the background on this image I'm showing, this is a still from a claymation video that Beyond Plastics created after Coca-Cola and Bill Nye the Science Guy put out a video supporting plastics recycling, saying, "What's not to love?" So let's start with a little pop quiz for you chefs out there. Who's familiar with shake and bake? And do you know what comes? Do you know what comes in a package of shake and bake other than the seasoning? You get a bag. You get a single-use plastic bag to use for the shake. Now, Shake and Bake announced this week in November, that they will no longer provide that bag, eliminating many pounds of plastic waste. Great news, right? Well, how many pounds of plastic waste do you think this one corporate change will eliminate? Here's some answers. Raise your hands where you are, and let me ask you, I'll go down the line. Actually, I'll start at the top, at D. Who thinks it's 1 million pounds of plastic that will be eliminated? Anyone? I'm looking at a single one, but well, if your hand is raised, you're not far off. The answer is 900,000 pounds.
Oh my God. There was no right answer.
Now, I don't think I could ever eliminate that much waste in my lifetime, even with my family's help, but this is a great example of how a simple corporate decision made in an instant can really move the needle on the plastic crisis. So well done to the Kraft Heinz company. Okay, I hope in the next 25 minutes or so, we'll learn it. You'll learn at least one new thing about plastics and its myriad impacts on us and our environment. I promise you'll learn something new starting right now. So here's a lightning round of the latest plastics news, Jeopardy style, in the form of a question. And the question is, did you know? Did you know that microplastics and nanoplastics are in the air we breathe, the water we drink, the rain that falls, and even the snowflakes we catch on our tongues? Did you know that plastic is everywhere on the globe, from the highest slopes of Mount Everest to our most remote deserts, and even to the bottom of the Mariana Trench? So in one lifetime, more or less, my lifetime and yours, humans have coated the planet with a fine layer of permanent microplastics. And did you know that in less than a decade, by 2030, our plastic pollution will likely double? Did you know that tires are a chief source of microplastics, and that the sea is spraying its microplastics back into the atmosphere, enabling long-range transport? And that's how the microplastics get these far-flung places. And did you know that tire microplastic runoff can carry persistent organic pollutants such as 6-PPD quinone, a chemical which leaches into the environment and was recently discovered to be lethal to salmon and perhaps other creatures? And did you know that plastic can function as an ecosystem or life raft for invasive species and microorganisms, allowing diseases and parasites to be introduced across continents? And there's a whole new sphere of science studying this ecosystem, also known as the plastosphere. And another term you might hear is novel entities. The plastic is a novel entity in our environment, and a lot of organisms don't know how to deal with it. They've never encountered it before. Did you know that plankton, marine microorganisms, are eating microplastic? These tiny Antarctic columbolans are at the bottom of the food chain, which makes nearly every other species dependent on them as a food source. And now they are introducing microplastics into that food chain. And I'm not a scientist, but that can't be good. So you can probably see where this is going. Plastic isn't only found in marine life. In January of 2021, the first evidence of microplastics in human placenta was discovered on both the maternal and fetal sides. That can't be good either. So especially as you'll see in the bottom bullet, if you can read it, microplastics aren't inert. They carry substances or chemicals which could affect human health and development. These substances are sometimes called EDCs, or endocrine disrupting chemicals, because they interfere with hormone action in our bodies, and they've been linked to many adverse health outcomes, including cancer, reproductive impairment, metabolic diseases and disorders, cognitive impairment, and falling sperm rates. And in February of this year, 2022, a report out of Israel found that microplastics not only leach toxins, but they can pick up additional POPs, persistent organic pollutants. They act like magnets, concentrating them in the body and depositing those pollutants where they don't belong, a phenomenon called joint toxicity. How about baby feces? Plastic is here too. Now, why is the baby bigger than the adult here? Because in this study published in September of 21, 6 New York State infants all had levels of PET in their stool, and 3 newborns also had microplastics in their very first stool, in the meconium. That infant stool contained, on average, more than 10 times higher PET concentrations than that of adults. It's thought that infants could be exposed to higher levels of microplastics because of their use of bottles, teethers, and toys. The PET in this graphic is the polyethylene terephthalate, the #1 plastic, and PC is polycarbonate. And the hits keep coming. In March of 22, we learned of plastic polymers discovered in human blood. In June, they were also found in human breast milk in 26 out of 34 samples. And you can see those little actually colored samples in the photos. And in April of 22, microplastics were found lodged deep in the lungs of living people for the first time. Living people. Particles were found in almost all the samples analyzed. The most common particles were polypropylene, which is used in packaging and pipes, and PET used in bottles. 2 previous studies had found microplastics in cadavers, so finding it in living subjects was to be expected. Where else do we expect? What's left? The brain. I'm fully expecting to read about microplastics crossing the blood-brain barrier soon. So did you know that? I apologize for such a heavy-hitting start to my talk. To lighten the mood, I created a meme. When I heard that the average person consumes a credit card's worth of microplastic each week, I created this.
There's water in the news.
That's crazy. That's right.
So I'll assume that everyone here is aware of the global marine plastic problem. Perhaps you've heard of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch and seen the turtle video and heard the statistic that a garbage truck's worth of plastic is added to the ocean every minute. A garbage truck every minute. This comprehensive multi-year report called The Reckoning with the U.S. Role in Global Ocean Plastic Waste is from the National Academies of Sciences, and it takes a deep scholarly look at the issue and offers this sage advice. If you can read it, number 1 on the left, reduce plastic production. That's their number 1 recommendation, reduce plastic production. As for whom they may be addressing, the report sets the record straight on which nations are most responsible. And you can probably guess the result. The committee was able to conclude that while only 4.3% of the world's population lives in the United States, our nation was the top generator of plastic waste, producing 42 million metric tons. This was in 2016, 42 million metric tons, with the per person plastic waste generation at 287 pounds annually. So each of us on average, 287 pounds of plastic waste. But here's some good news to punctuate these discoveries. There's also broad popular belief that plastic pollution, particularly marine pollution, needs to be addressed globally, even more so than climate change. The Marine Protection NGO Oceana, they surveyed 1,000 American voters and found broad bipartisan support of 81%. That they support policies that reduce single-use plastic at local, state, and national levels. The New Yorkers surveyed even higher at 88%. So here's the real reason I'm here with you today. If you take one thing away, I only want you to know and champion this message. As common sense will tell you, and as that reckoning report also concluded, our number 1 recommendation is to reduce plastic production. It's massively important that we turn off the tap. And by that, we mean the plastic production tap. What is that tap? Where is that tap? Well, the tap is the fossil fuel industry, because 99% of plastics are manufactured from fossil fuels. More specifically, most plastics manufactured in the US come from ethane, which is a cheap byproduct of hydrofracking. And to catch you up, the US is now, since 2018, the largest producer of oil and gas in the world, largely due to the shale revolution and fracking operations in Texas, North Dakota, Pennsylvania, and Colorado. And this reality should reframe how people think of the plastic crisis. It means that plastic is a climate change issue as it totally relies on fossil fuels. It means that plastic reduction can help us meet that 1.5 degree global warming target. Fossil fuels are integral to the production of plastics, but if one looks beyond just the production phase, you'll see that plastic pollutes at every stage in its life cycle. From extraction to transportation and processing, to the ethane cracker nurdle production, to exporting and importing, then onto its useful and likely very brief life in the hands of a consumer, before its inevitable disposition to landfill, incineration, or unmanaged waste. Now, collectively, these life cycle phases produce enough greenhouse gas emissions that if plastic were a country, it would be the world's 5th largest emitter of greenhouse gases, 1.7 gigatons to be exact. And if we compare plastics to an industry, say aviation, plastics contribute twice as many emissions to climate change as the aviation industry. So when your friends or colleagues ask, what has plastic got to do with climate change? A lot. And now let's compare to the coal industry. For those of you who already know or follow Beyond Plastics, you hopefully heard about this report, the new coal dropped in October of 2021. It conservatively estimates the carbon footprint of the US plastics industry and compares its emissions to that of coal. And it found that plastic is catching up to coal emissions rapidly, and that plastic is on pace to exceed US coal emissions by 2030. And that should be a stark realization for many, because plastic is effectively canceling out the hard-won gains achieved through coal plant decommissioning. Because remarkably, 65% of coal plants have been retired in the US. And now we're seeing a petrochemical build-out stepping in to fill its shoes. We don't have time to summarize all the report's findings. It examines 10 different stages of plastic production and their impacts measured in CO2 equivalents. Some of these may surprise you, such as the emissions and off-gassing of foamed plastic insulation, which you can read about. But the one finding that landed harder for me is this one. More than 90% of the climate pollution that the plastic industry reports to the EPA occurs in 18 communities, just 18 communities. And that pie graph, you can probably see those two states. Most of those communities are in Texas and Louisiana. And more plastic production is coming. With a surge of ethane availability, there is this expected build out of ethane crackers, mostly proposed in Texas, Louisiana, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. The newest, which just came online this week, I think yesterday was the official, is Royal Dutch Shell's Appalachia facility. The new Shell ethane cracker, this is in Beaver County, Pennsylvania. It sits on the Ohio River, and it's the first in the Appalachian region. Now, the American Chemistry Council projects that this region, which sits on the Marcellus and Utica shale basins, could support up to 5 ethane crackers. Now that it's completed, this one facility will pump out 18 million tons of virgin PET annually. Now, virgin plastic production itself is expected to quadruple by 2050 if unimpeded. So many people aren't aware of this fossil fuel plastic connection. The top line, plan A, is how most of us think of fossil fuels as energy's lifeblood, feeding transportation and heavy industry. But as renewable energy becomes more affordable and widely used, and as electric cars are adopted, the demand for fossil fuels will fall. So plastic is now a primary growth strategy for the oil and gas industry, a bankable plan B, if you will. Fracking, as you may know, is a method of extracting the shale gas from underground deposits. And millions of gas of fracking fluid are pumped deep underground, fracturing the bedrock so the pockets of gas can be captured. The primary gas being captured is methane, but another byproduct of fracking is ethane. And ethane is what most plastics are made from. And in Pennsylvania and the Marcellus Shale area, so much cheap ethane is coming out of the ground that chemical plants in the US can't use it all. So with such an inexpensive feedstock, the plastics manufactured from ethane is proving to be a rising revenue source for oil and gas. At the cracker plant, the ethane goes through a series of chemical reactions. It's turned into ethylene, which is then strung into polyethylene or PET. Phthalates or plasticizers are also added to create the PET pellets or nurdles. The nurdles are then made into many types of plastic products themselves, like water bottles, artificial turf, anything. The nurdles are themselves a source of pollution as they spill whenever they are transported or wherever they are transported. It's estimated that 250,000 tons of nurdles leak into waterways each year from plastic production facilities. But the lead on this story is what I want to focus on. These plants are themselves super polluters of carbon, and a plastic-driven boom or build-out of cracking facilities will lock in emissions for decades to come. So the market is being flooded with cheap single-use plastics because of the fracking boom. It's not hard to see how a quadrupling by 2050 is likely. And that would be well over 1 billion tons of fresh plastic annually. And don't forget all the plastic that has ever been made. It's still here, it's persistent, it ain't going anywhere. So this second graph shows cumulative plastic production. And it's just like any compounding investment. Instead of an 18,000% change, with compounding, we're really achieving 391,000% more plastic. Sorry, it's a planetary payload we can't carry and shouldn't accept. So who's ready to take on the two most powerful industries on the globe, the petrochemical industries? They don't look that scary, do they? Okay, let's look at nature next. The effects of plastic on climate and biodiversity can't be ignored. You know, the 2020 bushfires in Australia, which were greatly worsened by climate change, killed an estimated 1 billion animals. And plastic pollution readily kills wildlife, either by ingestion or entanglement. More than 2,400 marine species have been documented ingesting plastic, including over 90% of seabirds. The extraction of natural gas for plastics certainly contributes to climate change, with methane emission and leakage being a primary concern, as it's 25 times more impactful or harmful than CO2. I'll repeat that. Yeah, methane is 25 times more impactful or harmful than CO2. And the plastics also degrade and they off-gas. They release emissions as they break down in waterways or landfills, or when they're burned in incinerators. So it's not a stretch to say that the figurative flood of modern plastic is contributing to actual floods. And that's what we're seeing now. More intense storms mean more flooding. And sadly, the populations who contribute the least to the problem are often the most affected and have the fewest resources to recover. And I have no words for these images. So since 1950, I want to ask you to raise your hands if you're around before 1950, but since 1950, the world has produced nearly 10 billion tons of plastic, more than half of which was produced in the last 15 years. So after 2014, less than 9% of that plastic has been recycled, less than 9. And of that, only 2% was effectively recycled. The rest was downcycled into a less valuable product and eventually disposed of. Roughly 12% has been incinerated. What is not still in use is in landfills or in the environment. Plastic waste is an international social and environmental issue. Much of the global north ships their waste to be dumped on the global south, where it causes immense problems. In these regions, people may earn small amounts of money by picking through the waste for recyclables, but much of the plastic has no value. It is comprised mostly of film plastic, mixed materials, or it's contaminated. The US now produces nearly 42 million tons of plastic every year, and we generate the most per capita. 40% of new plastic is destined for single use. Okay, 40% goes to single use, such as the packaging shown here. One news tidbit, by the way, this was in October 21, a report from The Guardian draws connections between the phthalates, those plasticizers, in packaging, saying they may contribute to over 100,000 US deaths a year, mostly in older Americans. 100,000 US deaths a year, mostly in older Americans. And that report also calculated or estimated the cost of that loss of life between $40 and $47 billion per year. Okay, so what is the solution? Or the better question, whose solution should you believe? Because there are many false solutions being advanced, and some by good guys, right? Like Keep America Beautiful. Remember the crying Indian? Cleaning up litter feels great, but it doesn't turn off the tap. Neither do corporate pledges, plastic credits, sea sweepers, exporting schemes, store drop-offs, recycling by mail, or chemical recycling. You know, the list of false solutions keeps growing. But here's our inescapable conclusion. The real solution is we must turn off the tap on single-use plastics and reduce virgin plastic production. And to do that, policy is needed. The Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act is a federal bill aimed at reducing single-use disposable plastics, protecting frontline communities, and expanding container reuse and refill models to supplant plastic packaging. The Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act It was reintroduced in 2021. It attacks the problem on many fronts, including bans on single-use products and bags, a national container refund program, post-consumer content requirements for packaging, a standardized labeling system for packaging, waste export prohibitions, and also infrastructure and recycling program investments. So this is what meaningful change looks like. So take a good look. The BFFPPA, Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. And this is an example of extended producer responsibility, another acronym, EPR, extended producer responsibility, where the polluter pays. Now, extended producer responsibility, it's a funny term because producers today take no responsibility for plastic pollution. We consumers pay to have it carted away, landfilled, or incinerated, or our towns do. So to a producing corporation, it's an externalized cost, or one which they pass along to us. And the idea of EPR is to shift that financial burden for recycling from local government and taxpayers back to the plastic and packaging producers. Doing so holds producers accountable for the materials they use and incentivizes waste reduction and better design of lower impact products and packaging. So here are 6 principles from Beyond Plastics of effective EPR, because there's bad EPR and there's good EPR. So Beyond Plastics has had to create these guidelines. I'll read through them quickly. Holding producers accountable, which I mentioned. Producers should not be in control of regulating themselves through industry domination, producer responsibility organizations. No one would ask ExxonMobil to set their own climate emission standards. Number 2, reduce and redesign packaging, especially plastics. Reduce and redesign, that includes requirements and standards for reduction and reuse, recyclability, and recycled content. Put that right in the bill. EPR systems worldwide only reduce packaging and spur redesign when specific requirements are included in the legislation. Number 3, we have to get the toxics out of packaging. We can't have a circular economy when packaging contains toxic chemicals because they can leach out or build up during recycling. EPR should require companies to use safer alternatives. Number 4, make sure recycling stays recycling. Don't allow that definition of recycling to be corrupted to include waste to fuel, waste to energy, incineration, pyrolysis, gasification, chemical recycling, or advanced recycling. Make sure it stays recycling. Number 5, fund both municipalities and innovation. Send the funding to municipalities to fix our broken recycling systems and fund projects that reduce packaging waste and create reuse and refill systems. And number 6, expand or create a bottle bill. Beverage containers belong in a deposit return system, the most effective way to manage this type of packaging. This is the last info nugget for today, and I suspect what you'll be discussing after I leave. The 9% recycling rate that we in the US believed we were sustaining, dismal though it is actually closer to 5% when you examine the recyclability claims. Beyond Plastics and the Last Beach Cleanup published this report titled The Real Truth About the US Plastics Recycling Rate, and its findings were echoed by Greenpeace in its plastics recycling report, Circular Claims Fall Flat. Of course, now that we're towards the end of the talk, you're asking yourself, what can I do? Some ideas: join a local sustainability group. Join us, Beyond Plastics. We're supporting local groups and affiliate organizations who want to add a plastic pollution competency. You can contribute to a brand audit, if you've heard of these, where you pick up trash and then you audit whose trash it is. You can donate to an air or water or environmental justice organization, since plastic, as you've seen, is fundamentally contributing to those issues: air, water, and environmental justice. Personal lifestyle changes are certainly the easiest and fastest way to get started. And if your changes influence a whole household or extended family, then you amplify your impact that way. But in summary, we must reduce plastics at the source. Plastics are a fossil fuel product, and while some plastics can truly be life-giving, the vast majority are single use. Disposable plastic is flawed by design. It gets used momentarily and then is left to persist in the environment for centuries. The climate impacts are now well understood. We see the roadmap that the petrochemical industry would have us follow. There are lesser understood human health risks and reproductive impacts, not to mention wildlife and biodiversity impacts. The list goes on, and more unintended consequences are surfacing every day. So let today be the day you decide to resist and add your voice to our cause. Thanks.